This is the Voice of Russia with our weekly link-up with our studios in London, Washington, D.C. and Moscow. My name is Brendan Cole. The US President Barack Obama has refused to engage in what he says is wheeling and dealing as part of an extradition effort against the US intelligence leaker Edward Snowden. Speaking on a visit to the West African nation of Senegal, Mr. Obama also said the case would be dealt with through routine legal channels. Meanwhile, the top US diplomat in Hong Kong today warned earlier of a big struggle to repair Washington's trust in the semi-autonomous Chinese territory after the flight of Edward Snowden. The Consul General Stephen Young said Washington's confidence was shaken. Mr. Snowden is thought to still be at Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport, and it's believed he is now travelling on a refugee travel document issued by Ecuador, where he's applied for political asylum. Some call him an idealist, others a traitor. But what is for sure is that his case will be played out over a long time, both politically and in the media. Well, here to discuss this in our London studio is Andy Worthington. He's an investigative journalist and co-founder of the Closed Guantanamo campaign. We'll be joined by our guests in our studios in Washington, D.C. and in Moscow in a few moments. But first of all, Andy, the case is getting more and more dramatic by the day, a bit of a mixture of the film Terminal and Catch Me If You Can, both Tom Hanks movies, actually. But here he is. He's stuck in transit in Sheremetyevo Airport. What do you think how do you think his cause is going at the moment in terms of perhaps how the media is reporting whether or not he's a villain or a hero?
Well, I think, what's been happening is that there's a lot of focus on the, if you like, a kind of detective story of where is he, where's he going to end up. I don't think anywhere near enough focus on why the story is interesting, which is that this man has felt compelled to sacrifice his career for what he believes is the necessity of revealing to the American people and the world the extent to which we're living in a surveillance state, which is far too intrusive, as he puts it, and as I think many people believe. So we're having that playing out against other people calling him a traitor for doing this. And then a lot of the distractions about, what kind of a person is he, and, what's his relationship with the various countries that he's passing through in his attempt to find somewhere safe, which is, I think, quite understandable, given that he has, committed a crime.
I guess, he's a very eloquent and intelligent individual, and he seemed to be very calculating in how he released this information. Obviously, the big scoop when the story broke was the level of surveillance and just the sheer amount of information that the NSA had with regard to phone records and internet records of people. But as you say, now the debate's really focusing on the dramatic aspect of it. Is he on the plane to Cuba? Is he not? Where's he going to go next? Ecuador, Venezuela? Perhaps not quite what his intention would have been, I suppose, where the debate has shifted away from what he's revealed.
Yeah, I imagine so. And that's part of the problem of him having to seek safety. And I suppose it's legitimate to have discussions about, is he seeking out these countries because they're going to protect him, or is he allying himself with countries that may have issues with the United States? I suspect that it's, that he's just looking for safety. But I think it's very sad that it's distracting attention from the reason that he became such a cause célèbre in the first place, which is not that he randomly released some abstract information. It's that he, as I said, felt compelled to sacrifice his career, possibly to endanger his life, or at least to be in a position where he could end up imprisoned, because he wanted to reveal the extent to which people are being spied on. And to me, that's the crucial issue. I think that it's readily comprehensible from what's been happening that the notion that that our countries should regard the vast majority of the people, the citizens in their countries, as people who are innocent until proven guilty, is actually something that's not being played out like that. What we're seeing is states that seem to be massively obsessed with trawling for information about all of us, and revealing an obsession with power and a sense of paranoia that I think is very inappropriate.
When he gave that interview, which was on the Guardian website, and it was covered by every major network in the world, explaining his reasons why he released the information in the way that he did, you really got a sense that he was in control of at least his decision and his motives in terms of releasing that information. Do you feel that he's lost control now?
Well, I suppose he has, because in the sense that, he'd obviously spent some time planning the need to put this story out and to break that story in the way that it would, he hoped, and I think it did for a while, convey the proper message, which was this is something extremely urgent. I don't know whether he knew how it would then play out as to where he was going to have to go. He obviously had plans to a certain extent because the Hong Kong leg of the journey seemed to be something that came into play very quickly. But this kind of limbo that's going on now, I'm not sure. That doesn't look very planned. That looks like he couldn't do this phase before he'd actually broken the story. He couldn't plan out a full itinerary of everything that was going to happen. And I would imagine that he's disappointed that so much attention is being distracted from what his actual message was.
But he's been compared with Bradley Manning, the WikiLeaks leaker who leaked 750,000 documents online, and I'm sure he would have followed that case very closely, and indeed he's being given the support of WikiLeaks up until now, as we understand it. And it descended to an ad hominem attack on Bradley Manning. He would have been aware, I suppose, of those kinds of possibilities, and I'm wondering, in terms of a whistleblower, how would you compare his case with that of Bradley Manning?
Well, Bradley Manning was in a position where he got caught. So I think Snowden's obviously been looking at how can he not get caught. But he will have looked at the character smears. I would imagine that that people accept that comes with the territory. I understand that Glenn Greenwald, who is a reporter and was working for The Guardian, is now getting aggressive slander from various news outlets in the United States because he's a target as well. These are the kind of dirty tricks that get played. So I think that he would have known there would be attempts at character assassination. Like I say, I think the problem perhaps for him is this going to overwhelm what he was trying to do in the first place? And I'm rather upset that people engage in far too much tittle-tattle about this rather than focusing on what it was all about. This man wasn't throwing his life away for nothing. He was doing it because of some very, very serious concerns about what the United States was doing.
And for a perspective from the United States, we'll go to our studio in Washington, D.C. with Rob Sachs, our presenter there.
Thanks so much, Brendan. I'm here with Bruce Zagaris. He's a partner at Berliner Corcoran Rowe here in Washington, D.C. And I want to touch on some of the things we're hearing from our colleagues in London. First off, U.S. authorities have filed espionage charges against Snowden, but President Obama has not personally called the presidents of China or Russia because he doesn't want to elevate the importance of Snowden's case. He said other nations should be simply willing to return Mr. Snowden to the United States as a matter of course. So how important is this whole case? Is it something where this is, enemy number one, a public enemy, for the United States, or is this something just a nuisance? How do we gauge what to view Mr. Snowden as?
It's very important for the United States. It doesn't happen every day that you have a whistleblower who reveals the extent of surveillance, and then when the U.S. requests a country to arrest him and extradite him, that country, does not properly, according to the U.S., respond to the requests. So the U.S. definitely thinks this is an important case, and it is undoubtedly frustrated by its inability to have countries, namely Hong Kong and now Russia, arrest him and extradite him, or in the case of Russia, just return him.
What does this mean for the U.S. relationship with those countries? Already we've seen a strain with Russia. We've seen certain strains with China over cyber espionage issues. But people are talking about if he goes to Ecuador, that would be through Cuba, where there is a ongoing talk with Cuba to try to strengthen the ties between those countries, and then Ecuador, where again it's there is a treaty in place for extradition. So how do all these relationships get impacted by where Mr. Snowden may move to?
Well, each of the relations are complicated by the overlay between law and politics. In the case of Hong Kong, you have the fact that just a few days before Snowden was charged, Barack Obama was meeting with his counterpart in a shirt sleeves meeting in California, where one of the priority issues was the U.S. allegations of cyber hacking So, and as a result of that meeting, the countries agreed to establish a task force to talk about how to solve the problems of cyber hacking. So with China and Hong Kong, although the U.S. is irritated, the U.S. can't afford to derail these important cyber hacking discussions. With respect to Russia, the matter is complicated by the fact that the U.S. and Russia have no extradition treaty. So, in fact, there is no legal obligation for Russia to arrest and return Mr. Snowden. And an additional complication is that under international law, Mr. Snowden is arguably a political refugee. And under a number of international conventions, such as the 1951 Convention on Refugees, Russia cannot arrest and return to the United States someone who is in danger of being persecuted for his political opinions. And certainly in the case of Bradley Manning, we saw that once he was arrested, he was subjected to what most people believe is cruel and unusual treatment. So in the case of Mr. Snowden, who has said that the reason he did this was to expose what he thought was unfair amount of surveillance, he would be, if Russia did arrest him and return him to the United States, they would be allegedly in violation of a number of international treaties, including also the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, the issue with Ecuador is complicated by the fact that, yes, there is an 1872 extradition treaty, but it's a very old treaty and it's full of loopholes. And it's also complicated by the fact that already Ecuador and President Correa have sort of thumbed their nose at the U.S. in the case of Julian Assange. However, a problem for Ecuador is the fact that the U.S. is its largest trading partner, and the U.S. can end the trade preferences that it has under the Andean Trade Preferences Agreement with Ecuador. And indeed, if Ecuador does give asylum to Mr. Snowden, it's likely that Congress will do that. And so Mr. Correa has to weigh the potential adverse economic consequences with the politics of the situation.
One more question before we toss it to our colleagues in Moscow, which is the point that Andy Worthington was bringing up in London, which is, you know, we're talking so much about the hunt now for Snowden, but the conversation is moving a little bit past about what he did and whether or not what he did was courageous, heroic, or villainous. And that's still being debated here in the United States. With so much attention being focused on now just capturing him or bringing him to, you know, U.S. soil, where is there a room for that conversation about whether what he did was actually good or bad for the country?
Oh, there's ample room for a conversation. There's been a lot of attention in the United States. There have been hearings in Congress. There's been a lot of focus in the media. And you see an enormous amount of focus in the EU. The EU has demanded answers from companies like Google about their violation of the European directive on data privacy. And the EU countries, well, you already saw that the German head of state, Ms. Merkel, has pressed Barack Obama about this issue. So you're going to see a lot of discussion, not just in the United States, but between the United States and its close allies, and you're also going to see it in the courts in Europe.
I want to toss things over now to Dmitry Medvedenko in Moscow.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen. A very interesting conversation we're having on a very hot topic in a very hot city, actually, right now. Moscow is in a terrible heat wave, plus 36. But with me in the studio, we have Dr. Boris Martynov. He is Deputy Director of the Latin American Institute at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Mr. Martynov, thank you very much for being with us. Since we've had the opportunity to listen to pretty much, all of our guests before, both Andy Worthington and Bruce Zagaris, I'm going to first ask you to comment on some of the points that they've made. Well, fresh in the memory, Mr. Bruce Zagaris has said that since Russia and the U.S. indeed don't have an extradition treaty, then Russia would actually be in violation of international laws, both on refugees and others. How can Russia, in that respect, be reproached, because it is now being portrayed as, almost as enemy number one of the United States in that respect, in this situation at least? How can it be reproached if it's actually against the law to arrest Snowden? He hasn't broken any laws in Russia. If he is in Russia, we'll get back to that a bit later, and then he can't be extradited.
I suppose there is no any reason to guilt Russia for anything in this particular case, because first of all, we do not know what will be the next moves by Mr. Snowden, because up till now he hasn't yet asked for the asylum in Russia. So we are waiting. Let's wait and see. And we can't judge about his possible moves and about his possible actions nowadays. But if he, in case if he asks for the asylum, there must be some legal procedures for that, and the people and the parliament and the civil society, and as we know yesterday, for example, there were some moves by the part of the Russian civil society to give such an asylum, and so there are some discussions still among the people as for this, but the topic is very complicated, and let's wait and see, as I say.
Well, of course, that's the most commonly approach tactic, to wait and see what happens, but still, let's take a look back at Russia's position regarding the whole issue of Snowden. As soon as it broke, Russia was basically, I think, the first country where the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has said, it has been, taken by other countries such as the United States as muscle flexing. It has said that should Mr. Snowden actually ask for asylum, nobody else had before talked about political asylum for Mr. Snowden, then Russia would actually consider it. Now it seems Russia has backed out. Is it because of the way that Russia is being viewed by the rest of the world in this situation?
Well, in a way, maybe so. But, as we see, the United States also has lowered its rhetorics and even its threats as directed to other countries, namely Russia and China. So it testifies only one thing, that everybody was taken by surprise. Nobody expected the development of this situation precisely in this direction, and in Russia we did not also expect the variant that he appears in Moscow, and the situation is rather complicated. The only thing which we can say now. But on the other hand, the position of Mr. Lavrov is quite understandable if we remember the cases when the United States gave this asylum to the people which Russia demanded back. For example, for the Chechen separatists and the ex-minister of the so-called Republic of Ichkeria is living in the United States, and without any hampering, and we couldn't get him back. So in the diplomacy and the politics, everything is based on the law of the reciprocity. After all, I think it's partly understandable.
Okay, one more comment I'm going to ask you. Mr. Andy Worthington from London has said that the main question is, when we're looking at different countries where Snowden could end up, is he looking for safety or looking for U.S. enemies, basically? Now, Mr. Worthington has said he's more looking for safety rather than anything else. Now, do you think these are two actually separate things? Safety in terms of being a U.S. enemy, so-called enemy, or what do you think he's doing? Where is he going to end up?
I can't put myself in his place. It's very difficult. But I suppose that he is a person which can respond for its action, which he planned long ago, and he is determined to continue. But nowadays, precisely nowadays, I suppose that his main preoccupation, after all, is his proper safety, counting with the circumstances which we are talking about. First of all, about the decisiveness of the United States to get him back. And he, being a member of the intelligence society, knows all too well about the ways and means which can be used by the United States. So.
All right, Mr. Martynov, thank you very much. We will be getting back to you a bit later in the program. Now it's time to hand over to London, where Brendan Cole and Mr. Andy Worthington are with us. And if I may actually ask technically, Mr. Worthington, you have said before that he, as in Mr. Snowden, has lost now control over the situation. He had been leaking data consistently before, but now he has lost control over the situation. At the same time, we have heard that in order to get some kind of insurance, he has reportedly provided different sources of media with encrypted files, which would be decrypted should something bad happen to him. Now, what do you think of that?
Well, that's that's something that WikiLeaks, from my understanding, pioneered was the kind of bomb of information that could be used should anything bad happen to him. So I suppose that's a very contemporary way of playing cards to try and ensure that nothing terrible is going to happen to you. That's my thoughts on that.
And just following up on that, Andy Worthington, just on terms of the links between the NSA, the American intelligence, and the UK intelligence and GCHQ and the Guardian newspaper, of course, were at the forefront in revealing the links. What do you make of those? Is Britain really caught up in this? Is British intelligence caught up in this NSA level of surveillance, and to what extent is it, and to what extent should people in Britain be concerned about this case?
Well, it looks to me very much as though that's the case, and I think the extent of the Guardian's exposure of this has been amazing, and it's been extremely important. It looks very much as though Britain and America, Britain's working very closely with America on this, and I can only reiterate really that I'm worried that the presumption that the vast majority of people in any country are completely law-abiding, certainly mean no threat to their countries, is a line that has been massively overstepped by our governments. I understand that the technology has made that seem very attractive to them, but it seems very clear that the laws that are in place to allow them to conduct a certain amount of surveillance, the laws that are in place that are supposed to regulate how commercial companies behave, all of these appear to have been broken. And that's why it seems to me that it's an extremely important question that's been raised by Mr. Snowden, and that our response to it needs to be a sustained interrogation of the way our governments behave.
So it's a question of the legality of the surveillance, but let's be honest, the government can surveil anybody they want to, whether they're a terrorist threat, for instance, criminal cases, where agencies can look at online use and all that kind of stuff, and that evidence is presented in court often. If they want to surveil you, they can. So we shouldn't be terribly surprised if this data is available to government agencies because this is their job.
Yeah, in a way, I don't think it's surprising at all. What's important is that we were given official confirmation from the inside of the extent to which it was happening. I don't think many people who were aware of the ways that governments actually operate would be surprised that they've overstepped the mark. And certainly, from the Patriot Act onwards, when America has made it clear that they wanted access to information and they wanted to do that on their own terms, it's not surprising. I'm just glad that it's been raised so that we may be able to properly have this discussion about just because a government can do it doesn't mean that they should. And this is not just in terms of privacy. I think it's also in terms of the amount of money that's spent on it. Not so much in the UK, but in the United States, where there are so many intelligence agencies and millions of people employed, and the cost is insane.
But we shouldn't. Well, I mean, the George Osborne yesterday in Parliament announced an increase in budget to intelligence agencies. I think a boost them about 3 or 4%. The view there, I suppose, from the government is that we're under threat of iniquitous foreign forces, and they need to be stopped. So the government's message may not actually chime with what the citizenry think. The citizens might think, well, hang on, we don't want to be surveilled to this extent. The government is saying, look, we're a terror threat. We need to do this.
Well, that threat is very small. Government spokespeople to some extent will not agree with that. They will ramp up the threat. But I've spent years studying terrorism in relation to the prisoners at Guantanamo and other men seized in the war on terror. The narrative that is presented by governments, and that's both the United States government and the British government, is of a much more serious problem than I think there actually is objectively. So when you will see, stories of how many plots have been foiled, I think on close investigation, a lot of those plots were not real plots. They may have been, things that were in the early stages of being talked about. Those things don't necessarily turn into plots. I'm wary of the group of people who will trust what the government says. We are faced with an existential threat like no other. Therefore, you must let us do whatever the hell we want to do. That's essentially how it goes. I'm clearly staking my claim of being part of what I hope is a bigger group of people saying our governments need to be responsible about the way they treat us as suspicious, and they need to be careful about overstepping marks that are legal about what they're allowed to do.
Of course, and most people in the street would agree with you that the government is overstepping its mark. But the point is, for the government's perspective, it's in their interest to maintain this level of surveillance, to say that we are at threat of a terror attack, and we had a terror attack in London only about a month ago, but over 3 or 4 weeks ago. The threat of homegrown terrorism, the threat of Muslim Islamic extremists, and so on. And certainly this climate of fear has been ramped up since 9/11. And your group, Close Guantanamo, I mean, that chimes in with that, doesn't it? I mean, it only takes one attack for the government to say, look, I told you so, we need this.
Well, it does, yeah, but you can't have a world of 100% safety. What alarms me really is that if we could look back to before this surveillance era when everything wasn't connected, we've always had issues. There's always a very slight possibility that somebody will conduct a terrorist attack. But it's overplayed. That's my issue. And, when we didn't have all of this interconnectivity and the possibility of surveillance, we still managed to deal with things. I mean, actually, a lot of this is supposed to involve old-fashioned detective work and surveillance of a non-electronic kind, which we're not really hearing very much about. But, the police have always operated in that way of being able to identify people they regard as suspicious. I think this is the extent of the trawling on the part of all our governments is something that should alarm ordinary citizens.
Now, we'll go back to our DC studio with Rob Sachs.
Thanks so much. And I wanted to pose some of those issues to Bruce Zagaris here in our D.C. studios. Americans have had to come to grips with things like the Patriot Act and, knowing that our government is looking into our personal details in some way for a few years now. But now with these revelations of what the NSA may be doing in conjunction with other intelligence agencies like the British or something, are other countries now having to contend with that eerie feeling of Big Brother watching, and that's maybe not sit as well overseas as maybe Americans have come to terms with, okay, I'm okay with some amount of intrusion into my privacy?
Yes. I think many countries will start a conversation now, both within their countries but also with the U.S. I think that in the U.S. there's going to be now a much bigger focus on the extent of surveillance, whether it is in fact legal, whether it should be reformed. I mean, we're already seeing that. And indeed, one of the biggest problems with the surveillance was the same problem with the drone program. There was no real public discussion. So just ironically, 3 weeks before Snowden revealed the problem, you had Barack Obama's speech on counterterrorism and saying that at some point soon the war on terror has to come to an end. And also in that same speech, Barack Obama even questioned some of his own policies on, for instance, drones, and said, perhaps there should be some kind of a court, and he would himself be amenable to better controls on the use of drones. Well, the problem with surveillance is that when the USA Patriot Act was passed, it was passed in 1 month with very little debate. And although it's been reauthorized and the surveillance has been expanded, again, there's been very little public debate, or very little debate even in Congress. And so this incident, I think, is now starting to awaken Americans with the need to have a more vigorous debate about, how much surveillance we need, whether the surveillance law we have right now is proportionate with the threats that we have, whether the FISA court works properly. There's been a lot of debate, for instance, on the fact that FISA almost never turns down a request, and that it's not surprising because there's nobody to represent the other side.
Yeah, I was going to mention those FISA courts and thinking about the role of the judiciary branch of our government in providing a check on the NSA or intelligence agencies and saying, okay, you have to go through us to make sure this passes muster. But is there enough scrutiny of those courts or of these programs in general by the public or by people who aren't, directly involved with intelligence gathering so that we can feel like, okay, somebody is looking out for, the rights of individuals in terms of their privacy?
I would say there's not. In fact, one of the interesting elements of the Guardian's exposure was that it printed one of the orders from the FISA court. A problem with the public or even Congress giving oversight to FISA, the FISA court, is that everything is done in secret. So the public and only a very few members of Congress have any idea what's going on with the FISA court. And without transparency, there can't be proper accountability.
Dmitry Medvedenko, I know you had some questions as well. Dmitry in Moscow?
Yes. Thank you very much. We had some sound problems. I did not hear that. Well, I thank you all, gentlemen. If I may actually ask my guest over here, I'm here with, as a reminder, Dr. Boris Martynov from the Latin American Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Now, since this is your forte, I'm going to ask you this. Latin America has also been very open in its embrace to Edward Snowden. And why, for example, are they doing this in the first place? And is this actually a good option? And will it eventually lead to worsening of relations with the United States? Because it appears it is, because we've just been receiving reports Ecuador on Thursday waived preferential rights granted under a trade agreement with the United States already to show basically independence as it considers asylum for Snowden.
Yes. Well, you see, they have always had the tradition of so-called diplomatic asylum. And they were glorified for that in the scope of the international law. That's their contribution, historical contribution, which began still in the 19th century. So they are determined to continue. And as we see the example of Ecuador and Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy, that's very eloquent of that's characteristic of the contemporary conduct of Latin American countries. And I suppose that it is even not depend so much on the political orientation of this or that regime of Latin America, whether it should be Ecuador or Venezuela or even Cuba, because the very paradigm of the diplomatic asylum, political asylum is very characteristic for Latin America. And I suppose that for Ecuador, even having in mind all the possible difficulties with the trade and with political relations with the United States, so on and so forth, I suppose that it will be extremely difficult to Ecuador to deny the political asylum for Mr. Snowden. Another thing is that it may be in a way it may be Ecuador might be helped voluntarily by some other Latin American country, having in mind that it has already its problem with Assange. But I suppose that the situation is very positive in Latin America with respect to the possibility of that asylum.
What about political stability in the region of Latin America? I mean, should there be a change of government? For example, if Ecuador accepts and grants asylum to Snowden, then there's a change of government, and
Yes,
we have a new leader who is more friendly to the United States.
Thank to God, the political stability nowadays in Latin America is much better than, for example, in the last century. But after all, everything may happen. But even in this case, I suppose that for the new possible government, well, in Ecuador, if we imagine some situation, no? Even for the government with other political preferences, it would be extremely difficult to cancel the right once given. I suppose that's all. Another thing is that the United States, of course, have much more possibilities to influence the situation in some indirect way, so to say. Huh?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask Mr. Martynov a final question. I'm actually going to ask some of our other guests to give short answers on this. But just think about it. I mean, all the information that we have been receiving about Snowden has been very inconsistent. It has been actually contradictory at some points. We have not seen him anywhere outside his Hong Kong hotel. Could it be entirely possible, just a short answer, that he does not exist at all?
No. You see, I highly doubt that because I suppose that it's absolutely natural, the very appearance of such a person. He's not the first, he's already the second. Well, because nowadays the people, the physical persons, so to say, are acquiring rights, international rights, comparable with the rights of the states. For example, everyone, you and myself, we can address ourselves over the head of our government to some international structures. It means that we have international rights. And so if we have rights, we have also responsibilities. I suppose that more people of such kind will appear in future. So we must be ready for that. We must become more open.
All right.
Yes.
Dr. Boris Martynov, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go back to London, I suppose. Just Andy, what do you think? Why make yourself public and then just disappear?
Well, because he's having a problem finding out where to go. But he obviously very much exists. What's the interesting thing about his story is him exposing information that the United States government and other governments would like to pretend doesn't exist. That's the real hidden story here.
And following up on that, Andy, is he a hero? Is he a villain? Or is it too early to tell?
Well, it's difficult to tell exactly, what some of his political motivations may be, or affiliations in a kind of global sense. In terms of exposing the information to reveal that people are being spied on to an extent that is unacceptable, I think categorically this man is a hero. Yes.
I guess we'll have to wait and see as well. I mean, we still don't know where his whereabouts are. We do know he's in Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport, but we'll see. I'd just like to thank my guest here, Andy Worthington. He's a freelance investigative journalist and co-founder of the Closed Guantanamo campaign, talking to me here in London. In Washington, D.C., with our presenter Rob Sachs, was Bruce Zagaris, who's a partner at Berliner Corcoran Rowe. And in Moscow, with our presenter Dmitry Medvedenko, was Dr. Boris Martynov, who's deputy director of the Latin American Institute at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Stay tuned. Alice Lanyardo is here next with Curtain Up, our weekly culture show. She'll be looking at the 100th anniversary of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring.